knowing that to those who believe, it is the power of God. Thank you, Jared, for that reading. If you are interested in an outline, they're in the bulletins in the back. You can go ahead and grab one if you so desire. I want to welcome you all here this morning. And don't worry, today is not the worst day ever. That already happened. But this kind of language speaks to the overzealous misuse of hyperbole or exaggeration. Language is an incredible thing, given by God. We have a myriad of different languages, and unfortunately, it seems in our language, all of them came together at once. And so we have rules and regulations that don't mesh, that don't fit together, that cause all kinds of problems in how you spell things, which is what I blame for failing so many spelling tests. Not preparation, but the misuse of the language. But also the way the language works and the way that it's misused sometimes causes problems with perspective. I have heard young people, they say things like, I just literally died. You just literally died. Yeah, I just literally died. Who can say that in all legitimacy? Jesus, Tabitha, Lazarus, there's a few others, the widow of Nain's son. There's some people in the Old Testament who could say that. It's a very short list. You're most likely not on it. Stop saying literally, right? We overzealously utilize hyperbole and exaggeration to communicate things. Tim Hawkins is a fairly famous comedian, clean comedian as far as I can tell. He is denominationally bound, but a lot of his material is incredibly funny. He talks about his daughter going to the mall. He takes his daughter to the mall, and she ends up arriving there before her friends get there. And she is so upset that she is there first, that she has to now wait on her friends. And so his wife says, yeah, honey, that's the worst. The worst, he says. The worst, yeah, because, you know, some years ago, those Chilean miners who were stuck in the mine for more than a month, and they were running out of food, and they were having a hard time breathing. But you know what was worse than that? Being stuck at the mall without your friends being there yet. The overutilization of exaggeration really gets in the way of us using language for what it's really intended, which is to communicate. And language which is misused can oftentimes lead to misuse of perspective. We got to keep perspective, right? We've got to utilize our language correctly, not just for the sake of grammar Nazis, but more precisely because it keeps a level of consistency in how we talk, and it can help us keep perspective. It keeps us from being overly dramatic. And if you had a teenager, you know what that's like. Over-dramatization of everything. Everything is the worst. They literally die every couple of days. It's all the time, every time. And really, when you think about the worst day ever, we might use that, right? This has been the worst day ever. The worst day in the history of mankind. Let me tell you, you don't know what the worst day in the history of mankind was like. Imagine, if you will, in fact, Matthew chapter 26 and 27, something that even today is disregarded as both fantasy and fiction. Something that people, even in religion, don't consider all that important. The day that Jesus died. And I can say the day because, according to Jewish reckoning, the day started at 6 p.m. And at 6 p.m., about the time of twilight, Jesus is taking the Last Supper with his disciples. They is taking the Passover. And from then to the end of that day, which would happen at 6 p.m. the next day, Jesus spends what I consider the worst day in human history. And I do not mean to exaggerate, to use hyperbole in the slightest. Now, when we go to other countries, in mission work and whatnot, there are certain countries that have actively said, we don't want American missionaries. And that's not to be rude to Americans. Although, it's because their culture and their community, the way their world works, we would legitimately not survive there. And when I say literally not survive, I literally mean literally. That their temperatures are beyond what we would be able to handle on a daily basis. We would very likely die from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. We would suffer extremely in situations like that, or demand a level of comforts that their people generally are not exposed to, and it would be detrimental to those people to have to facilitate that kind of thing. And so they have actively said, please don't come here unless you're ready to be hot, or you're ready to deal with stomach ailments from the food that we normally eat, right? The conditions that an American is used to sometimes leads to us being hyperbolic, right? Exaggeratory. Now, Jesus, in this case, Matthew chapter 26, if you're there, if you're not, please turn with me. Matthew chapter 26, this day, Jesus almost begins the day by instituting the Lord's Supper. He tells his disciples that something really awful is coming. He effectively tells them that he is going to die. Now, this isn't necessarily a surprise to these guys. He's already told them 3 or 4 times now, depending on how the Gospels work out that counting. They've been told, and they've tried to get in the way. They've tried to stop the things that were going to happen. Jesus knows explicitly what's going to happen, even if he doesn't have divine revelation, even if he doesn't have some inhuman understanding of the things that are going to transpire. He has the Old Testament, and he has spent a good bit of time studying it. He can figure out pretty clearly what's coming. And it starts with an emotional or an emotional issue. There in Matthew chapter 26, look at verse 47. Now Jesus has already told him, as we talked about yesterday, Jesus has already spoken to this event happening. He knows that one of them is going to betray him. And we talked last week about all of them coming to Jesus and, is it me, Lord? Is it me? Is it me? And I have to imagine all 12 of them asked, which really is telling that Judas didn't intrinsically stand out until afterwards. You knew from John that he stole money from the money box that he held for the people. In verse 47, and while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. And so he approaches Jesus after Jesus has just finished praying. Just finished praying not only that this cup would pass from him and the anguish and the heartache that Jesus felt, but also John 17 is the full and complete prayer that he makes, which includes his disciples. He prays for himself, which is an excellent standard for us. It's okay to pray for yourself. In fact, Jesus did that very thing. He prays for the disciples who were there, and he also prays in John 17 for all those who would believe through their words. That's us. Jesus had the foresight to pray for us before the worst thing that would ever happen to any human being. And I don't just mean the physical torture. I mean the emotional torture that he would go through, all of the betrayals that would take place, all of the things that are about to happen that we'll go through, most of them today, and then inevitably imagine, and there's no way to, so it's kind of a ridiculous thing for me to ask you to do. Think about what it would feel like to have the weight of the world's sins thrust upon your shoulders. For you to die so that others might live. A people who do not care about you, a people who have rejected you, a people whom you have done all kinds of things for, fed and taught and helped and raised the dead for and healed. And yet, from the beginning of this day all the way to the end, Jesus knows exactly what he's getting into, and he chooses the path. He chooses the path. Now, the path was laid out for him, but it absolutely stood within his purview to change his mind. And yet he stayed the course. He continued along that path. 30 pieces of silver and a kiss later, and Jesus is taken by these unrighteous individuals. By Judas, who has betrayed him, though he is one of the 12. Immediately, he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And they came and they laid hands on Jesus, verse 50, and they took him. And suddenly, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Now, from other accounts, we learned that that's Peter. And the guy that lost his ear, his name is Malchus. And what happens when man gets involved with God's plan? We just cause problems. We just make things more difficult. Because then Jesus, he goes ahead and puts Malchus' ear back on. If Peter hadn't drawn his sword in zeal, deciding ahead of time, talking about it with Jesus, even that he would sooner die than Jesus be taken, than to deny him. I think Peter meant it. But Peter didn't mean it in the way that Jesus meant it. Peter meant it in a physical capacity. I will fight to the death for you. I will draw my sword, as he does, and I will cut off somebody's ear even for you. Imagine if that's what Peter had said. That would have been pretty impressive. But what does Peter do but cause Jesus more work? Like when you have kids. And you want them to learn, and early on they want to learn, and you soon find out that getting kids involved with anything takes longer and is more work. And even when they get older, they become more useful, but it's still a lot of work, and that's okay. Because you're teaching them how to be independent, how to do things for themselves. And so Jesus doesn't tell Peter before Peter cuts off Malchus' ear, by the way, don't cut anybody's ear off. Jesus could have. He could have said, Peter, I'd rather not have to put somebody's ear on while all this is happening. And so God doesn't always keep us from the things that we ought not do. Sometimes what he does is he helps us clean up the mess. Sometimes he goes through it with us. And I have to imagine from the perspective of God, me talking about how irritating my children can be sometimes, he's got to laugh at that. Because who needs way more work than my children need with me? Me with God. As immature as my children are because they're immature, because they're young, I am far younger than God. I am far more immature than God. I don't understand the things that God has for me all the time, and I make really stupid mistakes. And I imagine sometimes God just hits his head with his hand. We call it facepalm. I don't know where that came from. And sometimes I think about that when I make mistakes, when I don't do things that I'm supposed to do, when my life is not the way it's supposed to be. And I'm simply glad that God is patient with me. And now perspective comes in and it reminds me why I need to be patient with others. Both the people who are outside in the world and most especially my brethren. Why I need to be patient when a brother doesn't get something right away, or when we have a kerfuffle, that's what I'll call it. We don't have fights. We disagree on things. Or something happens and someone says something that maybe they at first wish they hadn't. It happens. But it reminds me, it gives me perspective. And these lessons intrinsically give me perspective on how I should live and who I should be. Jesus being the great example. And just as Jesus suggested, what happens there in 56? Verse 56, he says, "But all this was done that the scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled." He says, you guys have come as if you're approaching somebody who violently offends people, right? That is a robber, which is who he's crucified with later on, not thieves. And you got to remember that. Thieves is more like a cat burglar, someone who breaks in and steals things. A robber is someone who abuses somebody and takes what they want, is a mugger, right? It's someone who hurts people and then steals from them. That's much worse, though, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's still bad. He says, this was done. You guys approached me in this way. I haven't done anything to warrant this kind of response. Jesus hasn't once raised his hand to anyone He hasn't so much as thrown a stone. And yet they approach him as one who is a fierce criminal. But he reminds them, but all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Jesus said that would happen. He said, they'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And so they did. Now Jesus knew it ahead of time. Do you suppose that took all the sting out of it? The people he cared about most, the people he had been teaching for 3.5 years, the people he had been encouraging and helping and developing, they leave. And when people leave, it hurts. It hurts emotionally. Sometimes it hurts us spiritually. This could not have been a help to Jesus along his pathway. And then Peter, who he tells is going to deny him. Certainly, Peter is assured that that's not going to happen. And then in Matthew chapter 26, 69 through 75, Peter denies him 3 times even. And the first time it doesn't dawn on Peter. And the second time it doesn't dawn on Peter. No, I don't know this man. No, we're not friends. Now, I've been in situations like this. Not to the degree Jesus and Peter are. But I've had friends betray me. Stab me in the back. Do things to me that I would never have thought they were capable of, and especially to one of their own friends. And I still can't understand the level that Peter is on with Jesus. But it couldn't have been a joy that day to go through such things while you're being smacked in the face by the Sanhedrin, while you're being abused and questioned and challenged, and again, without sleep, without opportunity to rest. He's been moved from place to place. He's been taken from person to person. And then Peter denies him 3 times, just as was predicted. In John 21, you have this incredible scene. But remember, that happens later. John 21 is not this day. This day is the worst day in the world, the worst day ever. And yet, when Jesus has opportunity, he doesn't chastise Peter in the way that we would anticipate, in the way we might like other people to be chastised. Instead, he gently rebukes him. He asks Peter, when he takes him aside, he says, "Do you love me more than these?" 3 times he asks him that. And when Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," he responds, "Feed my lambs. Tend my lambs. Feed my sheep." The level of perspective that Jesus has is mind-boggling. And maybe that should go without being said. But the perspective that Peter has, the perspective that I have, the perspective that we all have is nothing like it needs to be. It's never like it needs to be. We never have the perspective that we truly need in order to be faithful to God in the ways that we should. Usually perspective comes from making poor decisions, like experience, unfortunately. And then what we consider the worst of all, I don't know, was the physical pain worse than the emotional pain that Jesus went through? Psychiatrists all around the world question that. Question which is worse, emotional pain or physical pain? And the physical pain is pretty excruciating. We'll talk more about the physical pain next week, in fact, concerning what actually happened with Jesus. But we see that he's railroaded by the community that he loves. I mean, he was just up on the hilltop looking over Jerusalem, talking about how he would love to gather her together as a hen gathers her chicks, but they would not. He would love to lead them into a promised relationship with God, into a utopian existence in heaven. They would not have it. And he knew from past experiences at least that they would not accept it, both now and for a long time. Some of them would never accept it. He was grabbed in the middle of the night after praying. I mean, imagine being in the most secluded spot you could find to spend time between you and God, and just after you finish praying, some people grab you and they lock you up and they take you to court and they bring in, verses 57 to 60, they bring in individuals who are going to bear false testimony. They are looking for anything to pin on Jesus. How would you act? How would you act in such accusations? You know what they're trying to do. They're trying to railroad you. And how angry it would make any of us. How wrathful we would be. And yet Jesus doesn't speak a word. He doesn't speak a thing concerning the accusations that are made, the false accusations. And they're, even from other accounts, paying individuals to say things that are lies. They found none, even though many false witnesses came forward. They found none, but at least 2 false witnesses came forward. Look at verse 61. And these false witnesses aren't so much false witnesses because they just said what Jesus said. This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. That's not exactly what he said. That's what they perceived that he said. That's what they thought he was saying. That's not what he was saying. In fact, we recognize when we went through this section that he's talking about the destruction of the temple, but his death, his body would be what's destroyed, and in 3 days it would raise. It would be restored. So this false testimony, liars are brought forward, and these people don't care that they're liars. They're actually happy that they're liars. And then they elicit another form of questioning. Look at verse 63. But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And now Jesus speaks. He's asking the question that Jesus was waiting for. It is as you said. He will not deny such a thing, even to his own detriment. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. Well, you have a responsibility when you accuse someone of blasphemy, and that's to establish that what they say isn't true to begin with. They have decided that Jesus is not the Son of God because he doesn't fit the parameters that they anticipate. He doesn't fit the person that they think he should be if he is the Son of God, and yet he is, which speaks to their perspective, which speaks to what they are anticipating, which speaks to their hearts to begin with. What further need do we have of witnesses? That's convenient. We don't need these witnesses anyway. Jesus has just said exactly what we need in our minds to prosecute him. Now there's a big problem here that they almost immediately run into. They're not Rome. And yet they're in Rome. At least they're in a Roman colony. And the individuals in the Roman colonies, even the governing authorities, don't have supreme ability to prosecute in this way. Capital punishment is not within their capacity. In fact, from my research suggests the only thing the Jews were actually legitimately allowed to do was to kill a person if they were caught in the temple defiling the temple. Which becomes an interesting issue later on when they throw Paul out of the temple when he supposedly brought Gentiles in, which he didn't. If they hadn't thrown Paul out of the temple, they likely could have stoned him in the temple and gotten away with it. Interesting that they threw him out. They were so irritated and somewhat irrational from their perspective that they do such a thing. But these guys, even if they have this in their mind's confession, that he is the Son of God, what further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? He says. And they answer and say, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face and beat him. And others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it who has struck you? And remember, Jesus has already told them back in the garden that if it was his will to stop this, he could have called a legion of angels. 10 legions of angels. That's a lot of angels. How many angels do you suppose it would take to stop these proceedings? To stop these men who came to take Jesus away from coming and taking Jesus away? I can't imagine it would take more than half an angel. And he can call 10 legions of angels to both take him down from the cross or to deal with these situations, to lay waste to the people around him who are brutalizing him, who are punching him and ridiculing him. And yet he remains calm, knowing that this is the plan that God has set in motion, that this is the plan that will result in the freedom of mankind from sin, eventually, for those who are faithful. And so he elicits this second line. And then look, in chapter 27, look at verse 15. A number of things happen here among additional beatings. Pilate, if you read all of the Gospels concerning this situation, Pilate does almost everything he can to not punish Jesus with capital punishment, not to kill Jesus. He does not want to kill Jesus. He literally says that twice. I find no issue with this man. There is nothing deserving of death in this man. I don't want to kill this guy. And even in the end, he washes his hands of them. And the people cry out that, let his blood be on us. They're so enraged with the idea of one claiming to be the Son of God. They don't care that he actually is. Imagine as Pilate brings out Barabbas, but instructs for the individuals to decide. It was a custom at the time that around the Passover that one of the prisoners would be released, and he happens to choose the worst possible convict in Israel at that time. I got this guy, his name's Barabbas. He's an awful human being. He's a rebellious man. He's one who's going to cause insurrection amongst the people. And then I've got this Jesus. And you all know who Jesus is. He is the guy who has healed so many of you, who has fed you so many times, who has taught you and instructed you. And you weren't sure, many of you, whether he was the Son of God or not. Now imagine you're Barabbas. Maybe Barabbas doesn't know what's happening here. And then all of a sudden you start hearing your name chanted. Give us Barabbas. Imagine you're Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. We want Barabbas. Well, perhaps he doesn't know that what they're asking for is Jesus' death. And then the guard comes down the hallway and he comes to your cell. And he unlocks the door and you go free, thinking that you are a dead man. And instead, the man from Galilee, the man who healed and taught and loved, he is the one who is taken rather than this Barabbas. After that, Jesus is tortured on a number of occasions. He is scourged, which we'll talk about more later. He is whipped. He is mocked. He has a robe put on his shoulders and a crown of thorns on his head. He's given a reed, and then it's taken back from him, and he is struck numerous times in the head with it. And then he must carry his cross. He must carry his own torture device to the hill where he is going to be tortured. Tortured until death. And he spends hours tortured on the cross. Look at Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3, look at verse 11. He's abused, he's beaten, he's tortured, he's beaten again. He says, now as the lame man who was healed held on to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them on the porch, which is called Solomon's, greatly amazed. So when Peter saw it, he responded to the people, men of Israel, why do you marvel at this? Or why look so intently at us, as though by our own power or godliness we had made this man walk? It was not us. The power was in another. He says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant, Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. But you denied the Holy One and the just, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, and kill the Prince of Life, whom God raised from the dead, of which we are witnesses. And his name, through faith in his name, has made this man strong, whom you see and know. Yes, the faith which comes through him has given him this perfect soundness in the presence of you all. Friends, what we're looking for, and what we oftentimes lack, is perspective. When we say things like, well, I had the worst day ever, I think we're being a little dramatic. And perhaps little there is an exaggeration as well. Perhaps we're being exceptionally dramatic. Jesus lived the worst day, I think, of anyone, because at the end of all of this, of being abused and beaten, being ridiculed, being sold, betrayed by his own people, denied by his disciples, railroaded by a community that he loved and cared about and supported and worked miracles for, and inevitably crucified, he had every opportunity to stop the proceedings, and he chose not to. He lived, in my estimation, the worst day ever. Thankfully, 3 days later, we have what I would consider the best day ever. That'll be in a couple of weeks. The best day ever will come in a couple of weeks. The lesson anyway. But it's all about perspective. So when we talk about our Christian walk, when we talk about our life in Christ, and we talk about, as we sang this morning in before the Bible class, 107, Follow Me. We talk about that song. I love that song because it speaks to me and how much I complain about the life that I live and the sacrifices that I have made, and then I look to Jesus and I am ashamed. Ashamed of complaining, ashamed of thinking that I have sacrificed anything when the Lord has sacrificed everything. When God has sacrificed even his own Son. Romans chapter 8, verse 18, For I consider that the sufferings of this present life are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And what does Peter tell them to do there in Acts 3? When all is said and done, you have crucified the Son of glory. You have called for a criminal to be released rather than him. And he tells them, repent and be converted, that times of refreshing may come to you and to yours. While things would inevitably work out for good on this day, one blow after another, physical blow into emotional blow, his closest friends fail him, the people he has cared for have turned on him. He even feels at the very end dejected by the Lord, by the Father of all. And yet he goes through all of it, that we might be saved.